Before smartphones, before supermarkets, Britain had something far more human: connection. The war had ended, but the rebuilding had only begun. Families stood in line for rations, yet there was laughter again in the streets. A new dawn was breaking over a country stitched together by courage and tea. If you grew up in those years, you remember the feeling. Hope wrapped in hard work. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. Every day began with the sound of the milkman, the radio, and the promise of something better. Britain was tired, but not broken. The fog of war lifted to reveal a people determined to start over. They had no blueprint, only willpower and worn hands. Rubble became gardens, ruins became playgrounds. Children played where bombs once fell, their laughter a quiet defiance. The smell of coal smoke mixed with the scent of bread and wet earth. Neighbours helped rebuild each other's walls, and faith returned in bricks and mortar. Everyone knew someone who had lost someone, and everyone carried on. It wasn't optimism, it was duty, stitched into the national character. Men went back to work with quiet pride. Women kept families together with less than enough. The kettle boiled, the news played, and a nation exhaled. Newspapers spoke of progress, but progress felt slow, heavy, and handmade. Ration books still ruled the cupboards, but the queues grew shorter each month. The sound of a typewriter was the sound of administration, of a country counting its blessings in triplicate. Factories reopened, schools filled, and church bells rang again. The old Britain was gone, but something steadier was taking shape. People painted their doors, planted flowers, and smiled more often. It wasn't victory they felt. It was survival turning into purpose. A cup of tea solved more than politics ever could. Even the silence of the streets held gratitude. At night, the glow of a single lamp in a small window meant we made it. The past still whispered through the cracks, but the future was moving in. In every humble act, washing, fixing, planting, the country healed itself. No speeches, no heroes, just millions of quiet triumphs. Britain was beginning again. One morning, one meal, one mended heart at a time. The fog lifted, the sun rose, and the sound of life returned. This was not the end of the war. It was the beginning of everything after. For most families, the heart of the home was the kitchen. The smell of coal fires mixed with bread, soap, and boiled vegetables. Everything happened around the table. Meals, arguments, laughter, and news. The kettle was always singing, a small hymn to endurance. Mothers stretched every penny, turning ration scraps into comfort. Fathers came home with tired hands and quiet pride. Children sat cross-legged on worn rugs, drawing worlds that felt brighter than reality. A single radio connected a whole family to the outside world. Voices from the BBC became old friends, steady, polite, reassuring. Evenings began when the lights dimmed and the news crackled. Tea was poured, biscuits shared, and the day folded itself away. The furniture was patched, the wallpaper faded, but everything had purpose. Electric cookers and washing machines were the marvels of the new age. No one wasted anything, not bread, not buttons, not time. The smell of soap and starch meant order, pride, and dignity. Parents didn't talk about love. They demonstrated it with every meal served. A child's laughter could fill an entire house of modest meals. Windows steamed with the heat of supper and family chat. Letters from relatives abroad were read aloud, passed hand to hand. Sundays meant roast, family photos, and a brief sense of abundance. No one needed luxury, they needed togetherness. A leaking roof or broken chair was fixed, not replaced. School shoes were polished like badges of honor. Bedtime stories came from memory, not from books. Curtains were drawn early, not for fear, but for peace. Rain on the roof was a lullaby. Silence was a comfort. The home was not perfect, but it was sacred. Every creak of the floorboard, every clock tick told a family's story. When the electricity flickered, candles came out and laughter followed. Neighbors borrowed sugar and returned conversation. In winter, families huddled close, sharing warmth and stories of better days. In summer, windows opened to the smell of cut grass and coal smoke. Children dreamt of the future. Parents prayed it would be kind. Through it all, the British home stood steady, humble, loving, and unbreakable. Before dawn, factory whistles echoed through narrow streets. Men in flat caps pedaled bicycles through the fog, lunch tins rattling on handlebars. The air smelled of coal, oil, and determination. Britain woke, not with alarm clocks, but with the hum of machinery. Women tied scarves over their hair and stepped into the rhythm of typewriters and sewing machines. The nation's strength was measured in calloused hands and unbroken spirit. Steel sparked, looms clattered, and hammers struck like music of survival. In the shipyards, sparks lit the grey morning like fireworks of progress. Miners disappeared into the dark, their lamps tiny stars beneath the earth. Each shift began with silence, then roared to life with purpose. Pay packets were thin, but pride was thick as smoke. Factory floors vibrated with the sound of recovery. No one called it sacrifice, it was simply what had to be done. Work wasn't about dreams, it was about dignity. At lunch, the same sandwiches, the same jokes, the same laughter. The clatter of tools was a hymn to resilience. Maine leaned on shovels and talked about weather, football, and the future. Women counted coins, planned dinners, and prayed the washing would dry. Steam trains carried the heartbeat of a nation across soot-covered landscape. The whistle of an engine meant progress, slow, heavy, unstoppable. Factories stitched together the future with thread and sweat. In the mills, music came from the rhythm of gears and looms. When machines broke, men fixed them without complaint. A bent nail was straightened. Nothing was wasted. Even exhaustion had grace, meant purpose fulfilled. Friday evenings smelled of ale, sweat, and relief. Wages were counted carefully. Dreams folded small inside envelopes. The walk home was long, but proud. Proof of another week survived. Work didn't just rebuild buildings, it rebuilt identity. The noise, the smoke, the sweat, all part of a nation learning to breathe again. Progress wasn't glamorous, but it was visible, steady, and real. The clanging of metal was more than sound. It was a promise. Each spark, each shift, each heartbeat said the same thing. We are back. In the glow of furnaces and street lamps, Britain's spirit worked overtime. Beyond the factories, Britain's heartbeat lived in its streets. Cobblestones echoed with footsteps, gossip, and the rattle of milk bottles. Every neighbour knew your name, and probably your business too. Shopkeepers swept their doorsteps, proud of the space they called their own. The butcher, the baker, the postman, faces as familiar as family. Children drew chalk games on pavements, laughter bouncing off brick walls. The smell of vinegar and newspaper meant one thing: fish and chips night. Pubs glowed like beacons, their warmth spilling into cold evenings. Inside, laughter clashed with the sound of pint glasses and jukebox tunes. The pub wasn't about beer, it was about belonging. If someone lost their job, a pint found its way to their hand anyway. Community wasn't a word, it was a reflex. People waved from buses, shouted greetings across the street, shared umbrellas in the rain. When television arrived, streets fell silent for half an hour, then filled with debate again. You didn't knock when visiting a friend, you just shouted you in through the letterbox. Every street had its gossip, its hero, its troublemaker, its storyteller. The milkman was a messenger, the coalman a saviour in winter. Mornings began with deliveries and ended with the smell of supper. Kids ran errands with pennies clutched in their fists, proud of the responsibility. Shop windows displayed everything from sweets to ration luxury, a glimpse of possibility. Postmen whistled, cats lounged in windows, life moved at a patient pace. There were arguments over fences and forgiveness by evening. A sense of order, unwritten but sacred, held the neighbourhoods together. Street lamps flickered on like a cue for stories to begin again. Couples walked arm in arm, heads down against the drizzle. Every sound, boots on wet stone, the rustle of newspapers, the hum of conversation, meant home. The rhythm of daily life was unhurried, deliberate, deeply human. No one thought of it as history, it was simply living. The post-war world might have been grey, but it was rich in connection. A broken window was fixed by someone down the road before you asked. No one was alone. Not really. Not when the streets still breathed together. Every block, every alleyway carried the same quiet truth. We were in this together. And as night settled, the glow of windows turned every neighbourhood into a constellation. The heart of Britain didn't beat in Parliament. It beat in its streets. On weekends, Britain exhaled. Men polished their bicycles and shoes until they shone. Women curled their hair, ironed dresses, and planned picnics with precision. Children burst into sunlight, their laughter louder than any factory whistle. The air smelled of grass, tobacco, and the promise of leisure. Cinemas filled with chatter and perfume. Ticket stubs clutched like treasure. The projector flickered, and the grey world turned golden for a few hours. Audrey Hepburn smiled. The audience sighed, escaped for a shilling. In seaside towns, families queued for ice cream beneath gulls and clouds. The pier was a runway for dreams, a stage for simple joy. Dance halls glowed with brass bands and polished shoes. Hands met, eyes locked. Futures began beneath coloured lights. Young love was clumsy but sincere, carried by melody and optimism. Football grounds thundered with cheers, pride echoing through terraces. Saturdays belonged to sport, to sweat, to belonging. Cricket on village greens meant peace, patience, and packed sandwiches. Sunday slowed everything down: roasts, hymns, naps, and quiet reflection. A nation that worked hard also knew how to pause. Evenings hummed with radio comedies, gentle laughter after long weeks. Neighbours shared leftovers, stories, and silence without awkwardness. Cinema newsreels showed a world opening up again. Jet planes, fashion, faraway lands. Magazines displayed colours brighter than memory could hold. New words appeared: holiday, style, weekend. Britain was learning pleasure again. Modest, careful, deeply earned. Music began to change too. Guitars joined pianos, rhythm joined restraint. The wireless became the soundtrack of renewal. Teenagers hummed new melodies, and parents pretended not to approve. Joy was returning. Not loud, but persistent, confident. Posters of stars replaced war maps. Lipstick replaced ration books. People smiled more easily, even in the rain. Parks filled with laughter, beaches filled with hope. Simple moments, a dance, a song, a shared meal, rebuilt the nation's soul. It wasn't indulgence, it was recovery in motion. For the first time in years, Britain remembered how to be happy. And it held that happiness carefully, like something fragile and sacred. As the 1950s faded, Britain stood on the edge of change. The war generation looked back, the young looked forward. The streets began to hum with rhythm, rebellion, and new ideas. Shop windows filled with colour, fashion grew bolder and shorter. Mary Quant's designs turned fabric into freedom. Scooters roared through narrow lanes like declarations of independence. Jukeboxes replaced gramophones. The beat was faster, sharper, alive. Teenagers became a new species, confident, restless, untamed. The word youth stopped meaning age and started meaning attitude. In smoky cafes, they dreamed out loud, unafraid of older eyes. Music wasn't background anymore, it was identity. Skiffle gave way to rock, and Britain began to tap its foot. Guitars replaced typewriters in bedrooms across the nation. Haircuts became protests. Hemlines became statements. Every town had a rebel, every street a song. The working class had found its voice and wasn't whispering anymore. London's Carnaby Street turned into a carnival of courage. Bright lights reflected off leather jackets and hope. Newspapers worried about morality. Youth called it freedom. The fog of the past burned away under neon signs. In Liverpool basements, a new sound began to form. Raw, loud, electric. The Beatles were tuning not just guitars, but an entire generation. Parents didn't understand it. That was the point. Change wasn't coming slowly anymore. It was roaring in. Girls wore eyeliner like armor. Boys wore pride like jackets. Love and politics met on dance floors and in coffee bars. Everyone was tired of survival. They wanted meaning. Post-war Britain was turning technicolor. It wasn't about escape now. It was about expression. The future had a pulse, and it was Britain. What began as rebellion became culture. What began as youth became legacy. Britain, once rebuilding from ashes, now led the world in sound and style. The nation that once whispered was finally singing, and the whole world was listening. By the time the 1960s arrived, the Britain that rebuilt itself was unrecognizable. The rubble had turned into rhythm, the ration book into record sleeves. The grey skies of survival gave way to neon, movement, and melody. A new confidence filled the air. Louder, freer, unstoppable. The people who once queued for bread now danced through Saturday nights. They had earned every note, every colour, every ounce of joy. Factories became studios, and workers became artists of a new world. It wasn't just progress, it was transformation. The sound of typewriters faded beneath guitars and laughter. Where there had been silence, there was now a song. The spirit that had carried Britain through its hardest years still lived on. It had only changed its rhythm. Old values met new dreams, and together they built something timeless. The courage of the past became the creativity of the future. Britain no longer followed. It led, and the world took notice. What began as recovery had become reinvention. You can still feel it today. In the stubborn pride, the humour, the heartbeat of every street. History doesn't stay in books, it lingers in the way we live. It's in every cup of tea, every queue, every small act of kindness that still defines us. The Britain that rose from the ashes never truly disappeared. It simply evolved. Every generation builds, breaks, and rebuilds again. And through it all, the same spirit whispers, keep going. This was not just a story about a country, it was a story about people. If you've come this far, you're part of that story too. Because remembering where we came from reminds us who we are. If you felt something watching this, don't just leave. Stay. Subscribe. There's more to tell.